Marissa Cole almost didn't see it. A single sheet of paper taped to the barn door her grandfather had built plank by plank over 40 years ago with his own two hands. She pulled it free and read the first line twice before it registered. $30,000. A lien. Not a bill, not a warning. A legal claim against land that had been paid off, free and clear, since before she was even born. Her grandfather, Walt Cole, never carried a mortgage on this farm. Not once in 40 years. And he never signed a single agreement with the Homeowners Association, now demanding $30,000 in his name. Here's the part that should be impossible. This farm existed 3 decades before that HOA did. So how does a dead man's paid-off farm suddenly owe a fortune to an organization that didn't exist when he bought the land? And how far would that organization go to collect on a debt that was never real in the first place? She was about to find out. Marissa had spent every summer of her childhood on these 40 acres, the pasture that rolled out toward the tree line, the old farmhouse with its crooked porch step, and that same red barn, standing since before she could walk. Her grandfather, Walt, had worked this land debt-free his entire life. When he passed 6 months earlier, he left it to her outright. No mortgage, no strings, just 40 acres and a lifetime of memory. She hadn't hesitated. She quit her job in the city, packed up an apartment she'd never really loved, and moved back to run the farm full-time. This wasn't a weekend hobby for her. It was her livelihood now, and it was the last piece of Walt she had left to hold on to. Lately, though, something had shifted at the edges of that piece. A new subdivision, Willow Creek Estates, had gone up next door, swallowing what used to be a quiet stretch of open county road. Neighbors had grumbled about the HOA creeping further than it should. Marissa never thought it would reach her. Then, just a week before that letter appeared on her barn door, she'd noticed something odd near her property line. Survey flags, freshly planted stakes. She hadn't thought much of it. She would soon wish she had. The number on the letter rang twice before a voice picked up. Warm, practiced, the kind of voice that had clearly delivered bad news to 100 homeowners before her. Willow Creek Homeowners Association, this is Gary Denholm. Not a management company. Not a clerk reading from a script. The HOA president himself. Marissa didn't waste time on pleasantries. She asked him straight, where exactly did this $30,000 debt come from, and how could her grandfather owe dues to an organization he'd never joined? Gary's tone didn't waver. If anything, it smoothed out further, the way a man's voice does when he's said the same reassuring lie so many times it no longer feels like one. Ma'am, I understand this is a surprise, but the debt transferred with the deed. That's just how these things work. She pushed harder. Transferred from where? Under what agreement? Walt Cole had never signed anything with the HOA, not once, not ever. That's when Gary reached for the phrase that would end up haunting the rest of this story. A recorded covenant. According to him, when the Willow Creek subdivision plat was filed years earlier, an annexation amendment had folded her grandfather's property into the HOA's jurisdiction. Quietly. Officially. On paper, at least according to Gary. Marissa asked to see it. Simple enough, she thought. If it existed, it would have a date, a filing number, a signature. Gary hesitated for just a beat too long. It's in the file, he said. I'll have the board pull it together and send it over when they get a chance. When they get a chance. Not today, not this week, no timeline at all. She hung up with an unsettled feeling she couldn't quite name yet. The sense of a man reciting a story he expected her to simply accept, the way the others apparently had. 2 days later, Gary showed up in person, unannounced. He walked her property line himself, clipboard in hand, boots crunching over grass that had belonged to her family for 2 generations. He gestured toward her fence line with the easy confidence of a man inspecting something that was already his to inspect. We'll need this documented properly, he said, almost to himself, jotting something down. Marissa stood her ground, arms crossed, watching him move across land her grandfather had walked every single morning for 40 years. Then came the line that shifted the whole conversation, delivered casually, almost as an afterthought. Look, the board has options if this doesn't get resolved, including a lien sale if it comes to that. He said it the way someone mentions the weather, like it wasn't a threat at all, like it was simply procedure. That evening, still rattled, Marissa drove down the road to see Pete, a neighbor who'd farmed his land even longer than Walt had farmed his. She laid the whole thing out for him, The letter, the phantom amendment, Gary's visit, the lien sale threat. Pete didn't look surprised. That, somehow, was worse. "You're not the first," he told her. He'd heard the same story from at least 3 other longtime landowners on the fringe of Willow Creek over the past couple of years. Same pattern, same surprise assessments arriving out of nowhere. Most of them, he said, just paid it. Easier than fighting. Easier than dealing with a man like Gary Denholm. Marissa sat with that for a long moment. Easier. Maybe. But easier wasn't the same as right. That night, she pulled out the folder of paperwork Walt had left behind. Deeds, tax records, an old hand-drawn map of the property boundary he'd kept tucked away for decades. She laid it next to a printed copy of the county's official subdivision plat she'd found online. And there it was. The first real crack in Gary's story. The boundary he'd walked that afternoon, the one he'd pointed to with such certainty, didn't match the county's actual recorded plat map at all. It matched something else entirely. Some other map. One that, as far as she could tell, had never been filed anywhere official. It wasn't proof of anything yet, but it was enough to know one thing for certain. She wasn't paying a single cent of that $30,000 until somebody produced actual paperwork, real paperwork, with a real filing number, not a story recited over the phone. She called Gary back the next morning and told him exactly that. His response came smooth as ever, but this time, something colder slipped in beneath the surface. "I'd hate for this to get complicated for you." The county recorder's office wasn't much to look at. Fluorescent lights, a line of metal filing cabinets, a clerk who'd clearly seen 100 people walk in looking exactly as frustrated as Marissa felt. But it was exactly where she needed to be. She requested 3 things: the original subdivision plat for Willow Creek Estates, the deed history for Walt Cole's farm, and the HOA's recorded covenants, the CC&Rs, the document that was supposed to govern every property the association claimed authority over. The clerk brought them out one by one, and Marissa spread them across the table like evidence in a trial she hadn't realized she was building. She found it almost immediately. Right there on the original plat map, in handwriting that had clearly been added by the surveyor decades ago, was a small, deliberate annotation running along the edge of Walt's parcel. Not included, existing agricultural use. 6 words. But they were everything. Walt's land hadn't been forgotten or overlooked when the subdivision was platted. It had been explicitly excluded, carved out on purpose, in the surveyor's own hand, at the exact moment Willow Creek Estates came into existence. This wasn't a boundary dispute or some technicality lost in decades of paperwork. Her grandfather's farm was never inside the HOA's jurisdiction to begin with, which meant there was only one place left for Gary's story to hold up. That mysterious annexation amendment he kept promising to send. She asked the clerk to pull it. The clerk searched, then searched again, checked an alternate filing year just in case the date had been misremembered. Nothing matched. No amendment with that title existed anywhere in the county's official index. Not that year, not any year. Whatever Gary had described to her on the phone, it had never been filed. Not once. Not anywhere real. Marissa stood there for a long moment, staring at 2 empty search results on a screen, and felt something settle in her chest that was somehow heavier than confusion. It wasn't a mistake. A mistake would have shown up somewhere, even in the wrong file, even under the wrong year. This was an absence, a hole where a document should have been. That evening, she went looking for something else entirely. Not proof, just comfort, if she was honest with herself. She climbed into the farmhouse attic and pulled down an old file box she hadn't touched since the funeral. Walt's box. The one she'd been putting off going through because she wasn't ready for what it might make her feel. Inside were his ledgers, decades of them, every entry written in his small, careful hand. Tax receipts going back further than she could count. Records of every dollar that had ever moved through this farm, kept with the kind of discipline that told her everything about the man who'd raised her, even in the years she hadn't been there to see it. And near the bottom, folded twice, was a letter. It had never been sent. No envelope, no stamp, just her grandfather's handwriting, addressed to a name she didn't recognize, someone who'd apparently sat on the HOA board years before Gary ever did. She sat down on the attic floor and read it. In it, Walt refused, plainly, firmly, without a hint of doubt, to join the homeowners association. He cited his farm's agricultural exemption. He wrote that his land had never been part of their subdivision and never would be. that he'd farmed this ground long before Willow Creek Estates existed, and that he had no intention of paying dues to an organization with no claim over him. Marissa read it twice, then held it against her chest for a moment, the paper crackling faintly in the quiet of the attic. This wasn't just about $30,000 anymore. It never really had been, not fully. This was about her grandfather's voice, his clearly documented decades-old refusal, and whether some board with a clipboard and a missing amendment was simply going to overwrite it now that he wasn't around to say it himself. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not to Walt. Not to this land. She should have known Gary wouldn't wait quietly. 3 days later, driving back from the feed store, she saw it before she even reached her own driveway. A formal notice, laminated and zip-tied directly to her front gate. Not mailed, not delivered to her mailbox where only she would see it first. Posted, publicly, visible to every car that passed on the road, to every neighbor walking by, to anyone at all who cared to slow down and read it. The notice came from the HOA's attorney this time, not Gary himself, and it did exactly what Gary's phone calls hadn't quite managed. It made the threat official. The lien timeline had been accelerated. 30 days. Not months of back and forth, not time to quietly gather more records. 30 days before the association would move forward with a lien sale on land that, as far as every real document she'd found could prove, was never theirs to claim in the first place. Marissa stood at her gate and read it twice, the way she'd read that very first letter on the barn door. But this one stung differently. This wasn't just a legal threat anymore. It was a message to the whole road, to every neighbor who drove past her farm on their way into town, to anyone who might wonder even for a second whether the Cole family had finally fallen behind on something they should have paid years ago. She thought of Pete and the others he'd mentioned, the ones who'd simply paid rather than fight. She understood, suddenly and completely, exactly why they had. It wasn't only about the money. It was about what a notice like this did to a person's name in a town small enough that everyone already knew everyone else's business. Gary didn't need to win in court to hurt her. He just needed enough people to see that gate and wonder. She pulled the notice down, folded it carefully, and added it to the growing stack of paperwork on her kitchen table, right next to the plat map, the empty search result, and her grandfather's unsent letter. Whatever this had started as, it wasn't just a paperwork fight anymore. It was a fight for her name, her land, and her grandfather's word, and she was done being quiet about it. Marissa called Gary the morning after she found nothing in the county's index. No amendment, no filing, no record of any kind. She expected hesitation, maybe even an apology. Instead, 2 days later, an envelope showed up in her mailbox. No return address, just a single photocopied page inside. There it was, the missing amendment. Or at least, something claiming to be it. She spread it out on the kitchen table and looked it over. A signature sat at the bottom, dark and crisp against the faded gray of the rest of the copy. Too crisp, like it had been added long after everything else on the page. Beside it, a notary stamp, official looking at a glance. But when she looked closer, the commission date on that stamp had expired years before the document was supposedly signed. Something about it didn't sit right. She couldn't have said exactly what, not yet. But she'd learned enough over the past few weeks to know that "doesn't sit right" was usually the first sign of something worth digging into. She drove into town the next day and brought the copy to a title attorney Pete had recommended, a woman named Sandra Voss, sharp-eyed, unbothered by small-town politics, the kind of person who'd clearly seen every trick a bad-faith HOA could pull. Sandra didn't need more than a few minutes with the page. "This font," she said, tapping the document, "wasn't in common use for legal filings back when this claims to be from. It's a modern typeface." She flipped to the stamp next. "And this recording number, it doesn't match the format the county used in that era at all. I can check, but I'd bet money this number doesn't correspond to anything real in their index." She was right. A phone call to the recorder's office confirmed it within the hour. The number matched nothing. No filing, no book, no page, nothing at all tied to that string of digits anywhere in the county's official records. Marissa left Sandra's office with a folder that was getting heavier by the day, and a feeling that had shifted from confusion into something closer to certainty. This wasn't a mix-up anymore. Somebody had made this document, recently, on purpose. If Gary noticed the walls closing in, he didn't show it. If anything, he pushed harder. A notice appeared at the community mailbox cluster near the entrance to Willow Creek Estates, the one spot every resident in the subdivision passed at least once a day. It wasn't addressed to Marissa directly. It didn't need to be. It referenced a delinquent property owner near the eastern boundary, whose unpaid assessments were putting the neighborhood's shared road maintenance fund at risk. Everyone on that road knew exactly who lived on the eastern boundary. There was only one property out there. Marissa heard about it before she even saw it herself. A woman at the feed store mentioned it, not unkindly, but with the particular caution people use when they've decided to keep their distance from a situation until it sorts itself out. A few neighbors who used to wave at her on the road started looking the other way instead. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet, steady chill settling in where there used to be warmth. It was working exactly the way Gary intended. He didn't need to win the paperwork fight. He just needed enough people around her to start wondering if maybe, just maybe, she really did owe something after all. Then came the night that made it personal in a different way. Marissa woke to the sound of her dog barking near the back fence line. Sharp, insistent, the kind of bark that meant something, not just a passing raccoon. She grabbed a flashlight and found the lock on her back gate cut clean through, lying open in the grass. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been taken. Whoever had done it hadn't come for anything except to make sure she knew they'd been there. The message arrived the next morning, zip-tied to her mailbox where she couldn't possibly miss it. A laminated flyer, printed in bold block letters. Notice of lien. Final warning. It wasn't informative. There was nothing on it she didn't already know. Its only real purpose was to be seen. By her, by anyone driving past, by whoever might still be undecided about which side of this story to believe. Marissa stood at the end of her driveway holding that flyer for a long time, the morning fog still hanging low over the pasture behind her. She thought about calling Gary right then and demanding to know if he'd had anything to do with the cut lock. She thought better of it. Whatever was happening here, she wasn't going to fight it with a phone call in the heat of the moment. She was going to fight it with paper, with proof, with patience he clearly hadn't counted on. From that morning forward, she documented everything. Every notice that showed up got photographed, dated, and filed. Every phone call with Gary or the HOA's attorney got recorded, with the required two-party consent disclosure stated plainly at the start of the call, so nothing she gathered could ever be thrown out on a technicality. A folder on her kitchen table grew thicker by the week. Plat maps, the forged amendment, the expired notary stamp, the mismatched recording number, photographs of the cut lock, photographs of the laminated flyer. She reconnected with Pete, and through him, two other longtime landowners on the fringe of Willow Creek, a retired couple named the Ashfords, and a quiet man named Roland who'd farmed his land even longer than Walt had farmed his. Both admitted eventually that they'd paid similar assessments over the past 2 years, not because they believed they owed anything, because it had felt easier than fighting a man who clearly knew how to make a person's life difficult if they didn't. Roland still had the canceled check. He dug it out of a drawer and handed it to Marissa without a word, like he'd been waiting for someone to finally ask. It wasn't just her case anymore. It was a pattern, and now she had the first real thread of proof to show it. Gary's response when it came was blunt. He called her directly, his voice carrying less warmth than it had during their first conversation weeks earlier. The board, he said, had authority to move forward with a lien sale hearing. 15 days. That was the new timeline, and he made it clear there'd be no further extensions. But underneath his certainty, something had started to crack. Marissa reached one of the other HOA board members by phone that same week, a woman named Diane, whose voice grew noticeably careful the moment Marissa asked about the amendment's origin. Diane didn't confirm anything. She didn't deny anything either. She just went quiet in a way that told Marissa more than words could have. Whatever Gary had built this case on, it seemed like he wasn't the only one who suspected it wouldn't hold up much longer. Sandra was the one who told her about the statute. Most homeowners never bothered to look into it, she explained. A state law requiring HOAs to disclose their board meeting minutes and financial records to any property owner who formally requested them, in writing, within a set number of days. Gary clearly hadn't expected anyone to know it existed, let alone use it. Marissa filed the request herself, certified mail, return receipt requested, citing the statute by name and number so there could be no confusion about her right to see it. The HOA had 30 days to comply. They took 29. When the records finally arrived, Marissa spread them across the kitchen table alongside everything else. The plat map, the forged amendment, the canceled check Roland had handed her. She read through the meeting minutes page by page, slow and deliberate, the way Sandra had told her to. She found what she was looking for on the third pass. There it was, buried in a set of minutes from years earlier. A brief entry noting that the board had ratified an amendment folding several fringe properties, including Walt's, into the HOA's jurisdiction. Short, clinical, easy to miss if you didn't already know to look for it. But directly above that entry sat something else, the attendance record for that same meeting. 3 board members listed as present. The HOA's own bylaws, included in the disclosure packet, required a quorum of 5 to ratify anything at all. 3 was not 5. Which meant that even if this amendment had been genuine, even if it hadn't been backed by a forged notary stamp and a recording number that led nowhere, it still would have never been valid in the first place. It had failed on its own terms, by the HOA's own rules, the moment it was supposedly passed. Marissa sat with that for a moment, feeling something settle into place. Every version of this story, real or fabricated, led back to the same conclusion. Her grandfather's land had never legally belonged to Willow Creek Estates. Not once. Not ever. The financial records took longer to make sense of, but once she started cross-referencing dates, a second pattern emerged, one that had nothing to do with quorums or notary stamps. Assessments collected from properties like Walt's, going back nearly 2 years, had been funneled into a special account. The ledger labeled it plainly, Boundary Landscaping Fund. Thousands of dollars deposited steadily, quarter after quarter. Marissa looked for the other half of that story, the receipts, the vendor invoices, anything showing where that landscaping money had actually gone. There was nothing, no contractor names, no itemized work, no proof that a single shovel of dirt had ever been moved with that money. The account, according to the HOA's own records, was under Gary's direct authorization. His signature appeared on every withdrawal. She stared at the numbers for a long time that night, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. This had never really been about a clerical mix-up or an overzealous board overreaching its authority. Somebody had built an entire structure, a non-existent amendment, a forged document, assessments pulled from land that was never even part of the HOA, and funneled real money through it into an account one man controlled. The next morning, she drove back to the county recorder's office one more time. Not to search this time, to ask them to put it in writing. The clerk who'd helped her weeks earlier remembered her by name now. When Marissa explained what she needed, official written confirmation, on county letterhead, that no annexation had ever been filed for Walt's parcel, the clerk didn't hesitate. It took less than a week to arrive. A single page, plain and unremarkable to look at, stating in clear language that the county had no record of any annexation, amendment, or boundary adjustment involving the coal property at any point in its recorded history. One page. But it demolished the entire foundation Gary's story had been built on. Marissa read that letter 3 times, then set it down gently on top of the growing folder, right next to Walt's unsent letter, like the 2 documents belonged together. In a way they did. One was her grandfather's voice, refusing this from the very beginning. The other was the county confirming, decades later, that he'd been right all along. She didn't wait long after that. Sandra connected her with a property rights attorney who took the case, and together they filed a formal objection to the lien, citing the missing annexation, the failed quorum, the forged notary stamp, and the mismatched recording number, all backed now by actual documentation instead of suspicion. They requested a formal hearing before the board, on the record, with all of it laid out plainly. Then Marissa did something that mattered just as much as the paperwork itself. She drove out to see Pete, the Ashfords, and Roland, and laid every piece of it out for them. The quorum failure, the landscaping fund with no receipts, the county's letter. She asked them, plainly, if they'd be willing to come forward too. Not just to get their own money back, but to help make sure nobody else on that road ever got a letter like the one that had shown up on her barn door. None of them hesitated for long. Roland especially seemed almost relieved to finally have somewhere to put the canceled check he'd been holding on to all this time. Driving home that evening, Marissa felt something shift inside her that she hadn't fully felt since this whole thing started. What had begun as one woman standing alone in a barn doorway, staring down a letter she couldn't make sense of, had become something else entirely. A coordinated case, backed by real records, carried now by more than just her voice. The tide, she could feel, was finally starting to turn. The community clubhouse smelled like stale coffee and folding chairs, the kind of room built for HOA newsletters and holiday potlucks, not for what was about to happen inside it. Every seat was filled. Word had traveled the way it always did in a small community, quietly, then all at once. And by the time Marissa walked in with her folder tucked under one arm, there wasn't an empty chair left along the back wall. Gary stood at the front, behind a small podium, looking exactly as composed as he had the very first time she'd called him. He wore a blazer for the occasion. He had a printed agenda. He looked, more than anything, like a man who expected this evening to go exactly the way every other evening like it had gone before. He opened without hesitation. He walked the room through what he called the annexation history of the eastern boundary properties, a smooth, confident recitation of dates and board actions, delivered in the same procedural tone he'd used with Marissa on the phone months earlier. He mentioned the amendment. He mentioned the board's authority. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that tonight's hearing was simply a formality before the lien sale moved forward as scheduled. He clearly expected no pushback. Nothing in his tone suggested he'd prepared for any. Marissa waited until he finished. Then she stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The folder in her hands did most of the work for her. She started with the county recorder's letter, holding it up long enough for the room to see the letterhead before reading the key line aloud. The county's own written confirmation that no annexation, amendment, or boundary adjustment had ever been filed for her grandfather's parcel. Not that year. Not any year. Then came the plat map, unfolded and turned toward the room, her finger resting on the surveyor's handwritten note along the edge of Walt's land. Not included, existing agricultural use. She let that sit in the silence for a moment before moving on. Finally, she held up the photocopy Gary himself had sent her, the missing amendment, and pointed to the notary stamp near the bottom. "This commission," she said, calm and even, "expired years before this document claims to have been signed." A murmur moved through the room, quiet but unmistakable. Then she set the folder down and reached for something else, something smaller, something that had nothing to do with recording numbers or quorums. Her grandfather's letter. She held it carefully, the way she had that night in the attic, and told the room, briefly, what it was. A letter Walt Cole had written years earlier and never sent, addressed to a board member long since gone, refusing outright to join the association he was now being accused of owing $30,000 to. She read a portion of it aloud. His words, plain and unwavering, stating that his land had never been part of Willow Creek Estates and never would be, that he'd farmed that ground long before the subdivision existed, and that he had no intention of paying dues to an organization with no claim over him. Her voice held steady until the very last line. Then, just barely, it caught. The room went quiet in a different way now. Not the murmuring, uncertain quiet from a moment before. Something heavier. Something that sounded, for the first time all evening, like the room remembering there was a real person and a real man who was no longer alive to say any of this himself, standing behind every page in that folder. Gary, for the first time since the meeting began, didn't say anything at all. Pete was the first to stand. He didn't wait to be called on. He simply rose from his folding chair near the back, cleared his throat, and told the room plainly that he'd received a nearly identical letter 2 years earlier. Different amount, same vague language about unpaid dues on land he'd farmed for 30 years without ever once joining the HOA. He said he'd paid it. Not because he believed he owed it, but because fighting a man like Gary Denholm had felt like more trouble than it was worth. He looked directly at Gary when he said that last part. Roland stood next, quieter but no less steady, and confirmed the same pattern, a surprise assessment, a vague threat, a payment made just to end it. When he mentioned the canceled check, he actually held it up, worn and faded, like he'd been waiting months for the right room to show it to. Then the Ashfords stood together and told their version. The same shape, the same pressure, the same quiet decision to simply pay and move on, rather than risk whatever options the board might exercise next. One story might have been dismissed as a misunderstanding. 4. told back to back, in the same room, in front of the same board, was something else entirely. The room could feel it shifting. The first real crack in the board itself came from a woman near the front, one of the members who had, until tonight, mostly nodded along with whatever Gary proposed. "I want to understand something," she said, turning toward him rather than the audience. "This landscaping fund, where exactly did that money go?" Gary opened his mouth to answer, but she wasn't finished. "Because I don't recall ever seeing an invoice for it. Not once. Not in 2 years of meetings." Another board member picked up right behind her, the man who oversaw the HOA's finances on paper, though clearly not in practice. He asked bluntly, who had actually verified the amendment before enforcement letters started going out to homeowners? Whether anyone besides Gary himself had ever laid eyes on the original filing. Silence sat there a beat too long before Gary answered. He tried to recover. "Give him that," he tried. He raised his voice slightly, insisted this was nothing more than a paperwork misunderstanding, a clerical gap that predated his time as president, exaggerated now by a handful of homeowners looking for an excuse not to pay what they owed. But something in the room had already moved past him. The murmurs weren't quiet anymore. People were leaning toward each other, whispering, glancing at the letters still resting on the podium beside Marissa's plat map. A man near the middle row said, just loud enough to carry, that he'd wondered about that fund for a while now and never felt like it was his place to ask. Gary's composure, so steady all evening, had started to fray at the edges. His answers came faster now, less measured, more defensive than procedural, a man scrambling to hold a story together that everyone in the room could see was already coming apart in his hands. It was the HOA's own attorney who finally stopped things cold. He'd been sitting off to the side all evening, mostly silent, occasionally jotting something down. Now he stood, cleared his throat, and addressed the board directly rather than the room. "Given what's been presented tonight," he said carefully, "I'd recommend we take a recess. I'd like the opportunity to review this new documentation before anyone moves forward with anything." He didn't look at Gary when he said it. He didn't need to. The board chair called the recess a moment later, gaveling the room into an uneasy quiet, chairs scraping as people rose to stretch or whisper to their neighbors. Marissa stayed exactly where she was, her folder now nearly empty, every page inside it already out in the open where the whole room could see it. Whatever happened next, one thing was already clear. This wasn't a formality anymore. It wasn't going the way Gary had walked in expecting. Something had cracked tonight, right there in front of everyone, and there was no putting it back together the way it had been before. 3 weeks passed before the board reconvened. 3 weeks Marissa spent not waiting quietly, but preparing, meeting with Sandra and her attorney twice a week, gathering one last piece of documentation that would close the final gap in the case. She'd sent the photocopied amendment to a forensic document examiner Sandra knew, someone the county occasionally used in fraud cases. The answer came back 2 days before the hearing, typed plainly across the top of the report. The notary stamp did not match any commission ever issued to the notary whose name appeared on it. When Marissa followed up directly with the state's notary licensing board, they confirmed it in writing. That particular commission number had never existed at all, not expired, not outdated, invented. She read that confirmation 3 times before she let herself feel anything about it. Then she added it to the folder, right on top. This time, the hearing wasn't held in the clubhouse. Given how far things had escalated, the board had moved it to a formal proceeding, a small conference room at the county building, a court reporter present, the HOA's attorney seated at one table, Marissa and her attorney at another, and the full board arranged along the far wall like a jury that hadn't yet decided which way it was leaning. Gary sat beside the HOA's attorney, blazer buttoned, posture stiff. He didn't look at Marissa when she walked in. She didn't need him to. The board chair opened the proceeding plainly, noting that new documentation had been submitted since the last meeting, and that today's purpose was to review it in full before any further action was taken on the lien. Marissa's attorney went first. He laid it out in order, methodical and unhurried, the way Sandra had coached her it should be done, not with anger, but with proof. The county recorder's letter went onto the table first, plain and unambiguous. No annexation, no amendment, no boundary adjustment ever filed for the coal parcel, at any point in its recorded history. Then the plat map, the surveyor's handwritten exclusion still legible after all these years. Then the forensic report on the notary stamp, followed by the licensing board's written confirmation that the commission number didn't exist. He set each document down slowly, letting the silence between them do as much work as the words. Then came the financial records, the ledger entries showing assessments collected from properties like Waltz, funneled steadily into the account labeled Boundary Landscaping Fund, every withdrawal authorized under Gary's own signature, not a single invoice or vendor receipt anywhere in 2 years of records to show where any of that money had actually gone. The room stayed very quiet while that page sat on the table. Then it was Pete's turn. He'd worn a collared shirt for the occasion, sat straighter than Marissa had ever seen him sit, and answered the attorney's questions plainly, describing the surprise assessment he'd received 2 years earlier, the vague threats that followed when he'd hesitated to pay, and his decision in the end to simply hand over the money rather than fight a man who clearly knew how to make life difficult for anyone who didn't. Rowland testified next, the canceled check now formally entered into evidence, his voice steady even as he admitted, plainly, that he'd paid out of fear more than obligation. Then came the Ashfords, telling the same story in their own words. Different amounts, same shape, same quiet pressure to simply comply rather than draw attention to themselves. 4 separate homeowners, 4 nearly identical stories. The pattern that had once lived only in scattered conversations along a country road was now sitting on the official record, sworn and on the transcript. Diane, the board member who'd sounded so careful and evasive on the phone weeks earlier, was called next. She didn't hesitate this time. She confirmed, under questioning, what the meeting minutes had already shown, that the meeting where the amendment was supposedly ratified had only 3 board members present, not 5. Not the quorum required under the association's own bylaws. "I remember that meeting," she said quietly. "I remember thinking it felt rushed. I didn't ask enough questions at the time. I should have." It wasn't a dramatic confession. It didn't need to be. It was simply the truth, finally spoken aloud by someone who'd been in the room when all of this had started. Then Marissa's attorney turned to her and asked if she had anything further to enter into the record. She did. She brought out Walt's old ledgers first. Years of entries, in his careful handwriting, documenting every dollar that had ever moved through the farm, decades of discipline laid out on paper for anyone in the room to see the kind of man he'd been. Then she brought out the letter, the one that had never been sent. She didn't read the whole thing this time. She didn't need to. She simply stated for the record what it was, her grandfather's own written refusal to join the association, years before Gary ever sat on its board, citing the farm's agricultural exemption in his own plain words. She placed it gently on the table alongside the ledgers. For a moment, the room wasn't a conference room anymore. It was something closer to a courtroom, holding space for a man who couldn't be there to speak for himself, and didn't need to be because he already had, years ago, in his own handwriting, waiting patiently in a file box for someone to finally read it aloud. The HOA's attorney was the one who finally turned to Gary. He'd been quiet through most of the proceeding, letting the documents speak for themselves. But now he set his pen down and looked directly across the table. "Mr. Denholm," he said, "I'd like you to walk us through the origin of this amendment. Specifically, who drafted it and when?" Gary shifted in his seat. His answer came slower than his usual smooth cadence, padded with phrases like, "to the best of my recollection," and "from what I understood at the time." He said the amendment had existed in the association's files long before he became president, that he'd simply inherited it as established fact, that he'd had no reason to question something that predated his own involvement. "So you never personally verified its filing with the county?" his own attorney said. Not really a question. "I assumed it had been handled properly," Gary said. "That's what the file indicated." "But you've now heard testimony," the attorney continued, "that the meeting where this was supposedly ratified didn't meet quorum. And you've seen the county's written confirmation that no such filing exists in their index at all, and a notary commission number that the state confirms was never issued to anyone." Gary didn't answer right away. For the first time all evening, his composure cracked visibly, a tightening around his jaw, a shift in his posture that had nothing to do with confidence anymore. "I don't know where that photocopy originated," he said, his voice sharper now, defensive in a way that hadn't shown itself until this exact moment. "I received it from a prior board member's files. I didn't create it." "Did you verify it before enforcing it against Ms. Cole's property?" the attorney pressed. "Before threatening a lien sale on land the county has now confirmed was never part of this association's jurisdiction?" Gary's answer, when it finally came, arrived quieter than anything else he'd said all night. "No," he said. "I didn't." He tried, briefly, to redirect, insisting the landscaping fund had been used appropriately, that receipts existed somewhere even if he couldn't produce them today, that this whole matter was being blown far out of proportion by a handful of disgruntled homeowners who simply didn't want to pay their fair share. But the room had already stopped listening the way it once had. The board chair asked him plainly, one final time, whether he could produce a single invoice, vendor record, or receipt showing where 2 years of collected assessments had actually gone. Gary said nothing at all. The silence answered for him. The board didn't take long to deliberate. They didn't need to. Every question that mattered had already been answered, on the record, by documents nobody in that room could argue with. The chair read the resolution aloud, plainly, without ceremony. The lien against the coal property was voided in full, effective immediately, on the grounds that no valid annexation had ever brought the parcel under the association's jurisdiction. The board further resolved to refund every improperly collected assessment to Pete, Roland, and the Ashfords, with interest, within 30 days. And, in a motion that came almost as an afterthought but mattered more than anything else said that evening, the board voted to open a full, independent financial review of the association's accounts under Gary Denholm's tenure, starting with the Boundary Landscaping Fund. Gary was asked to step outside while the board finalized the language of the resolution. He didn't argue. He simply gathered his folder, buttoned his blazer out of habit rather than composure, and left the room without meeting anyone's eyes. Afterward, out in the hallway, Pete clapped Marissa on the shoulder, and Roland shook her hand like he meant to hold on to it a moment longer than a handshake usually called for. The Ashfords thanked her quietly, the kind of thanks that didn't need many words behind it. Marissa didn't feel like celebrating exactly. Relief, yes, a weight lifting that had been sitting on her chest since the morning she found that letter taped to the barn door. But not triumph. Not the kind you'd want to gloat over. Before she left, she asked her attorney one more thing. Not about herself, not about the money, not even about Gary. She asked that the county be formally notified of the board's resolution, so the record would be permanently corrected, so that no future owner of that land, whoever they might one day be, would ever open their mailbox to find a letter like the one she had. Her attorney told her it would be handled within the week. Marissa nodded, folded her copy of the resolution, and walked out into the parking lot where the evening had gone quiet and cool, the way it did most nights out here, far from streetlights and clubhouse fluorescents. She thought of Walt, and the letter he'd written but never sent, sitting in that file box for years, waiting for someone to finally read it aloud in a room that mattered. Tonight, it finally had. The county recorder's office looked exactly the same as it had every other time Marissa had walked through its doors. Fluorescent lights, quiet counters, the same clerk who now recognized her on sight and gave her a small, knowing nod as she approached. This visit was different, though. She wasn't there to search for something missing. She was there to watch something get corrected. The clerk pulled up the file and, with a few keystrokes, formally recorded the board's resolution against the property, the lien released, voided, and marked permanently in the county's records as invalid from its inception. No annexation, no jurisdiction, no debt that had ever legally existed in the first place. Marissa asked for a certified copy of the release, and the clerk printed it without hesitation, sliding it across the counter along with a small, quiet smile. "Congratulations," the clerk said. "Not many people follow through on something like this all the way to the end." Marissa thanked her and folded the paper carefully, the same way she'd folded that very first letter months ago, back when she'd stood shaking in the doorway of her grandfather's barn. It felt strange, holding paperwork that finally said what she'd known all along, instead of contradicting it. Back at the farmhouse that evening, she cleared a small space on the wall near the kitchen, the same wall where Walt used to keep an old calendar and a few photographs. Nothing elaborate, just a place he'd glance at every morning with his coffee. She framed two things side by side. On one side, the fraudulent photocopy of the amendment, the forged signature, the invented notary stamp, the piece of paper that had once threatened to take this land out from under her. On the other side, her grandfather's letter, the one he'd written but never sent, his plain and steady refusal preserved now behind glass instead of folded at the bottom of a file box. She stood back and looked at them together for a long moment. Not as trophies, not as anything to boast about to visitors. Just a quiet reminder, for herself, of exactly what she'd fought through to keep this place standing the way Walt had always intended it to stand. Free, clear, and entirely her own. Word of Gary's resignation reached her before the official notice did, the way most things in this community eventually did, through Pete, who'd heard it from someone at the feed store, who'd heard it from someone else entirely. Gary stepped down from the board within weeks of the hearing, before the financial review had even finished gathering its first round of records. He didn't make a public statement. He didn't need to. The silence around his departure said enough on its own. The HOA brought in new leadership shortly after, a smaller, quieter board led by a longtime resident named Carol, who'd been vocal from the very first community meeting about wanting real answers on the landscaping fund. Under her leadership, the association authorized a full third-party financial audit, reaching back through every year of Gary's tenure. The audit, once it concluded, confirmed what the hearing had already made clear. Tens of thousands of dollars, collected under the guise of boundary landscaping, with no vendor records, no completed work, and no accounting for where any of it had actually gone. The findings were shared openly at the next general meeting, read aloud without softening, and for the first time in longer than most residents could remember, the room actually trusted what it was hearing. It became something bigger than Marissa's case by then. It became the moment the whole community started asking questions it probably should have been asking for years, not just about Gary, but about how easily an association built to serve its residents could quietly start serving one person instead. Late one evening, sitting on the porch step Walt used to favor, Marissa let herself think back on everything since that morning at the barn door. She'd come into this grieving, unsure whether she even had it in her to keep this farm running on her own, let alone fight an organization with lawyers and letterhead and a decade's head start on intimidating people into silence. There had been nights, especially early on, when paying the $30,000 just to make it go away had crossed her mind more than once. It would have been easier. Pete had told her as much himself, the very first time they'd talked about it. But easier had never been the same as right, and somewhere along the way, maybe it was the plat map, maybe it was Walt's letter, maybe it was simply refusing to let a stranger with a clipboard rewrite her grandfather's clearly stated wishes, she'd stopped weighing the two options against each other at all. She felt different now, sitting on that step, steadier, not because the fight had been easy, but because she'd come out the other side of it, and the farm was still hers, still standing, still exactly what Walt had left it to be. And she felt something else too, something she hadn't expected when this all started. She felt less alone out here than she had in a long while. Pete, Roland, the Ashfords, they weren't just neighbors anymore. They were people who'd stood up in a room together and told the truth, even when it would have been easier not to. The refund checks arrived within the 30 days the board had promised, each one mailed out with a short formal letter acknowledging the improperly collected assessments and the interest owed on top of them. Pete's arrived first. He drove straight over to the farm to show Marissa, half laughing about it, saying he'd half expected another 2 years to pass before anyone actually followed through. Roland's check came a few days later, and he finally did something with that old canceled check besides carry it around in his wallet. He framed it, in his own kitchen, the same quiet way Marissa had framed her 2 documents. The Ashfords' refund came with a little more than they'd expected. The interest calculated further back than they'd realized applied. They mentioned, almost shyly, that they wanted to do something to mark the whole thing finally being over. Not a big to-do, just something with the people who'd stood in that room together. Marissa didn't need to think long about where that should happen. The following Saturday, cars started pulling down the long gravel drive toward the farmhouse a little after noon. Pete's truck first, then Roland's, then the Ashfords', then a handful of other neighbors who'd simply heard about it through the same quiet channel everything traveled through out here. It wasn't a big gathering. Folding tables set up near the barn, a couple of coolers, someone's homemade potato salad, kids chasing each other around the pasture fence while the adults stood in loose clusters talking. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would have looked out of place on any ordinary Saturday. But it wasn't an ordinary Saturday, and everyone there knew it. Marissa stood near the barn door for a moment, watching it all unfold, and thought about how often Walt used to do exactly this. Pull a few chairs out, put on a pot of coffee, let neighbors wander in and out of the yard on a slow afternoon like the property line between one farm and the next barely mattered at all. She hadn't hosted anything like this since he passed. It felt right that the first time she did, it was for this. Pete raised a plastic cup at one point, more informal toast than speech, and said simply that it was good to stand on this land again without wondering whether some letter was waiting in the mailbox. A few people laughed. A few nodded quietly instead. Either way, everyone understood exactly what he meant. Later that evening, after most of the cars had pulled back out down the gravel drive and the yard had gone quiet again, Marissa walked out to the back gate, the one where the lock had been cut all those months ago. She'd replaced it herself weeks earlier, right after the incident, but she'd never quite gotten around to fixing the section of fence rail beside it that had loosened when whoever cut the lock had shoved through in the dark. Tonight, with the last of the daylight fading gold over the pasture, she finally did. She tightened the hinge, checked the new lock twice out of habit more than necessity, and stood there a moment with her hand resting on the gatepost. It was a small thing. Practical. The kind of repair that wouldn't mean anything to anyone driving past on the road. But standing there, gate secure under her palm, the farm quiet and whole behind her, Marissa felt something settle that had been unsettled since the morning she found that letter taped to the barn door. The land was hers. It always had been. Now, finally, everyone, the county, the board, the whole community that had once quietly wondered, knew it too. Marissa would later say the hardest part was never really the paperwork. It was learning to trust her own judgment over a stranger's letterhead, to look at an official-looking document, feel the instinct to simply comply, and choose to ask a harder question instead. She'd come into this grieving, still finding her footing on land she'd inherited, but hadn't yet learned to fully stand on. She left it having learned something she hadn't expected to learn at all, that authority isn't the same thing as legitimacy, and that a certified letter, a notary stamp, or a confident voice on the other end of a phone call can carry all the appearance of legal weight without carrying a single ounce of the real thing. She'd also come to understand, more clearly than she ever had before, exactly what she owed her grandfather in all of this. Not money, never money. She owed him the fight itself, the refusal to let a photocopied lie quietly erase a lifetime of decisions he'd made clearly, deliberately, and on the record, long before anyone tried to tell his granddaughter otherwise. Honoring him wasn't just keeping the farm running, it was making sure his voice, even unsent, even folded at the bottom of an old file box, still got the last word. If there's one thing worth carrying away from Marissa's story, it's this. Know the actual recorded history of your own property. Not what a letter claims, not what a phone call insists. What's actually filed, on record, at your county recorder's office. Most people never think to ask. Most associations count on exactly that. Request the public records. Pull the plat maps. Ask for meeting minutes and financial disclosures if something ever feels off. Most states give you the right to see them, whether or not anyone volunteers that fact to you first. And never assume a document is valid just because it looks official. Official looking and legally real are not always the same thing, and the only way to know the difference is to check. That's Marissa's story. One homeowner, one barn door, and a debt that never should have existed in the first place. If this story reminded you of something you've been through, an HOA dispute, a fine that never made sense, a fight over land or paperwork you had to stand up for yourself, drop it in the comments below. These stories matter, and so many of you have your own version of Marissa's fight. And if you want more real stories like this one, ordinary people standing their ground against systems that counted on them not to, make sure you're subscribed. There's more coming.